Michael and Diane Holloway thought they had raised the perfect daughter, but Claire Holloway, the quiet, gifted girl admired by neighbors and praised by teachers, was secretly a calculating predator whose double life would shatter her family and shock an entire community. The Holloways were the kind of family that people envied from a distance. Their house, a neat two-story home with white shutters and a trimmed lawn, stood as a picture of stability in a quiet suburban town where everyone seemed to know everyone else. Michael Holloway worked as an insurance agent, his reputation built on honesty and dependability. Diane, once a nurse, dedicated her time to community projects and church events. They raised their only child, Claire, with love, discipline, and opportunity. To their friends and neighbors, the Holloways embodied the perfect family, one without cracks or shadows. Claire herself appeared to be every parent's dream. She was graceful and intelligent, a child who seemed incapable of rebellion. She played the piano at school recitals, her fingers gliding across the keys with effortless control. Teachers praised her essays, noting the maturity in her words. At the local animal shelter, she worked tirelessly, feeding the dogs, cleaning cages, and coaxing shy cats out of corners with quiet patience. She was polite in conversation, never raising her voice, never stepping out of line. To outsiders, she was a portrait of innocence. Her parents watched her with pride. At family gatherings, relatives marveled at how well-mannered she was. Older neighbors admired her willingness to help with groceries or mow their lawns without being asked. Michael and Diane often discussed how lucky they were to have such a daughter. While other families fought with teenagers over curfews and school grades, the Holloways never had such struggles. Claire never gave them reason to worry, yet behind her calm smile, there were glimpses of something harder to define. Claire preferred to spend long hours alone, locked away in her room with notebooks she never shared. She wasn't the type to gossip with friends or chatter on the phone. When invited to parties, she politely declined, preferring solitary walks through the park. Her parents chalked it up to shyness, believing she was simply more thoughtful and mature than her peers. They never considered that her solitude might hide something darker. Even as a child, there were small moments that went unnoticed or quickly forgotten. A neighbor once found her staring at a bird that had fallen from its nest, the tiny creature still breathing. Instead of rushing to help, Claire calmly observed it until it stopped moving, her expression unreadable. Another time, during a summer picnic, she disappeared into the woods for nearly an hour and returned with scratches on her arms and a satisfied look that no one could explain. These moments were dismissed as quirks, harmless oddities of a bright but unusual child. The Holloways carried on believing in the perfect picture they had built around her. In their eyes, she was destined for great things, someone who would make a difference in the world. They couldn't imagine that beneath her quiet surface there was something lurking, waiting to grow. To them, Claire was light itself, the embodiment of everything good they had poured into her life. They could not know that the shadows she kept hidden would one day consume not only her but also the peaceful life they cherished. The first disappearance came on a warm spring night when a college student named Emily Carter failed to return home after visiting friends. Her car was discovered parked along a rural road with the keys still in the ignition and her phone lying on the passenger seat. At the time, police believed she might have wandered off after a minor accident or chosen to run away from the pressures of school. Flyers went up, search teams combed the woods, but nothing turned up. In a town where crime was rare, the case shook residents for weeks before gradually fading into the background. People told themselves that Emily had likely left by choice. Months later, another girl vanished under equally strange circumstances. This time it was a waitress finishing a late shift, last seen walking to her car in the restaurant parking lot. Her purse was found abandoned on the ground. Once again, police scoured the area, questioning co-workers and friends, but no solid leads emerged. The town buzzed with rumors. Some whispered about human trafficking, others blamed drifters passing through. Fear began to creep into daily routines. Parents grew more cautious, young women were urged not to walk alone at night, and neighborhoods organized watch groups. The disappearances stretched over 3 years, each one sending ripples of unease through nearby towns. The cases were scattered across county lines, which meant different police departments handled the investigations separately. Without a central link, no one saw the bigger picture. Families of the missing clung to hope, gathering for candlelight vigils and begging the public for information. News outlets covered the stories briefly before moving on, leaving behind grieving parents and unanswered questions. To the Holloways, these events felt distant, like storms blowing over another horizon. They watched the reports on television, shaken like everyone else, but never once imagined any connection to their family. Claire listened too, her face calm as she sat on the living room couch beside her parents. If her eyes lingered too long on the screen, no one noticed. She offered no opinions, only quiet nods whenever her mother sighed at the tragedies unfolding nearby. It was only when detectives knocked on the Holloway front door that the fear became personal. A witness had reported seeing a vehicle matching the description of Michael Holloway's sedan parked near the wooded trail where one of the missing girl's belongings had been recovered. The timing aligned almost exactly with the night of her disappearance. Michael, confused and alarmed, explained that the car had likely been at home in the driveway. He insisted there had to be a mistake. Diane echoed his protests, pointing out that Michael rarely left the house after work. Detectives listened politely but pressed for details. They asked who else had access to the car, who else could have been driving. Michael admitted only his daughter sometimes borrowed it, usually for errands or trips to the library. The officers noted the statement without comment, leaving behind a heavy silence after they departed. For the first time, the Holloways felt a seed of unease growing in their otherwise stable home. What had once been a distant mystery was now knocking at their door, asking questions they didn't want to consider. The night Michael discovered the hidden room began with something entirely ordinary. A pipe in the basement had been leaking for days, leaving a damp smell that spread through the house. Determined to fix it before the damage grew worse, he carried down his toolbox and crouched near the exposed wall. As he tightened the valve, his flashlight caught the edge of a wooden panel that seemed slightly off from the others. It wasn't flush with the rest of the basement wall, and when he pressed against it, the wood shifted just enough to reveal that it could be moved. At first, he thought it was just a poorly fitted repair from the previous owner. Curious, he tugged harder until the panel gave way, swinging inward to reveal a narrow gap. Behind it was a space he had never seen before. The air was stale and heavy, filled with the smell of dust and something faintly metallic. He stepped inside, shining the flashlight across the walls. What he saw made his stomach twist. Shelves lined the room, and on them were items that had no place in a family home. Old journals stacked in neat piles, photographs pinned carefully in rows. Objects that seemed trivial at first glance: bracelets, hair clips, worn sneakers, but each one was labeled with a date written in Claire's familiar handwriting. He picked up a journal and flipped it open. The words inside were written with precision, page after page of detailed accounts. They described how a girl had been followed for weeks, what bus she took, where she ate lunch, how she often walked alone. Then the entries shifted into colder territory, describing the night she disappeared and the method of her death. The handwriting never wavered, the tone never betrayed hesitation. Michael dropped the journal as if it had burned him. His heart raced in disbelief, his mind refusing to accept what his eyes had seen. Diane, hearing the noise, hurried down the stairs. When she entered the hidden room, her reaction mirrored his: shock, confusion, denial. Together they scanned the walls covered with photographs, each face eerily familiar from news reports. They recognized some of the missing girls, their faces smiling in snapshots now surrounded by Claire's notes. On a small desk in the corner lay folded maps marked with circles and lines, as though someone had charted movements and escape routes. The room was a shrine to something unthinkable. Every object pointed to careful planning and obsession carried out with methodical precision. Neither parent wanted to believe their daughter was capable of such acts, but the evidence was overwhelming. The handwriting was hers, the photographs were organized in her style, the journals filled with details only the killer could know. Michael and Diane stood frozen, struggling to make sense of the child they thought they knew. The basement was no longer part of their safe home, it had become a tomb of secrets. What they uncovered that night shattered the image of perfection they had built around their daughter. The hidden room did not belong to strangers, nor to some unknown intruder. It belonged to Claire. And with that realization came a silence heavier than any sound they had ever heard. The investigation that followed tore away the last fragments of denial. Once police were alerted to the hidden room, they cataloged every item with clinical precision. The shelves of trophies, the journals, the maps, everything was boxed and taken as evidence. Forensic teams confirmed what the Holloways had feared. Fingerprints, DNA traces, and handwriting samples all linked directly to Claire. The journals weren't stories or fantasies as some might have hoped. They were records, cold and exact, describing real crimes that had baffled investigators for years. Each entry corresponded with one of the unsolved disappearances. The hidden room became the missing link tying together cases that had once seemed random. Authorities began to reconstruct Claire's double life. To her parents and neighbors, she was a quiet, disciplined young woman who excelled in school and avoided trouble. But when examined closely, a different pattern emerged. Surveillance footage placed her near bus stops, diners, and libraries where victims were last seen. Phone records showed gaps in her timeline that matched the nights of disappearances. She had deliberately used her father's car on several occasions, creating an explanation for witnesses who reported seeing the vehicle near crime scenes. The careful planning was undeniable. Investigators described Claire's methods with a detached tone that made them even more chilling. She stalked her victims patiently, learning their habits and waiting for the right moment. She chose people she could isolate quickly: students leaving campus, waitresses finishing shifts, joggers on quiet trails. She avoided leaving obvious traces, disposing of evidence in ways that initially kept police from drawing connections. What had once looked like random vanishings now formed a clear pattern, a single hand moving silently in the shadows. For Michael and Diane, each revelation felt like a personal blow. They were asked to sit with detectives, shown photographs of victims alongside pages of their daughter's writing. At first, they shook their heads, searching desperately for another explanation. But with every detail, the truth closed in tighter. The trinkets taken from victims were displayed on tables during evidence review, and both parents recognized objects they had seen in the house before: an old bracelet they thought was bought at a thrift store, a necklace Claire once claimed she found on the ground. They remembered those moments clearly now, but at the time they hadn't questioned them. The Holloways were forced to confront the possibility that the daughter they had raised had never been who they believed. The polite smiles, the soft voice, the helpful gestures, all of it had masked something hidden, something carefully concealed beneath layers of normalcy. Claire had lived two lives, and she had lived them well enough that no one, not even those closest to her, had suspected the truth. The community, too, struggled with the revelation. Neighbors who once praised her discipline now avoided mentioning her name. Parents who trusted her to babysit their children recoiled at the news reports. The girl who had seemed like a model of goodness was exposed as the predator who had haunted their towns for years. What disturbed everyone most was not only the scale of her crimes, but how seamlessly she had blended into ordinary life. She had smiled, she had volunteered, she had studied, all while carrying the secrets of those she had taken. The mask had been perfect. And only when it slipped did the horror become visible. Claire's arrest came quietly, almost unnervingly so. On a gray morning, officers arrived at the Holloway home while the neighborhood was just beginning to stir. Birds sang in the trees, sprinklers clicked across manicured lawns, and people leaving for work barely noticed the police vehicles parked discreetly at the curb. Upstairs, Claire sat in her bedroom, reading a book as though nothing in her life was unusual. When officers entered, she did not resist. She placed the book on her knit-stand, stood calmly, and allowed them to place her in handcuffs. There was no outburst, no tears, no pleas. It was as though she had been expecting it all along. News of the arrest spread rapidly, and the shock it caused was unlike anything the town had experienced before. People who had known Claire struggled to comprehend the reality of the accusations. Teachers remembered her as quiet but brilliant, neighbors described her as helpful and kind, and her volunteer work had touched countless families. Yet the evidence displayed by police left no room for doubt. The journals, the trophies, the photographs, each one pointed directly to her guilt. Local news stations replayed images of the Holloway home again and again, each broadcast peeling back the illusion of normalcy that had once defined the family. Court proceedings brought even more horrifying details into the light. Prosecutors revealed that Claire had confessed to following her victims long before acting, often spending weeks watching them from a distance. She admitted to choosing her targets carefully, focusing on those she believed would not be immediately missed. Her confessions were not emotional but detached, almost clinical, as if she were describing a research project. Psychologists who examined her testified that she displayed traits of extreme detachment, her ability to mimic empathy masking an emptiness beneath. Michael and Diane attended the hearings, sitting stiffly at the back of the courtroom. They listened as their daughter was described not as a brilliant student or a loving child, but as a predator who had ended 12 lives. Each testimony carved deeper into their sense of identity. How could they reconcile the daughter they raised with the monster painted by investigators? Their faces, once familiar to neighbors as symbols of community pride, became symbols of tragedy. Strangers whispered about them in grocery stores, and friends who once visited regularly now kept their distance. For the victims' families, the revelations were devastating. Candlelight vigils turned into somber memorials, and photographs of lost daughters lined courtroom walls. Each family demanded to know how Claire had hidden her crimes for so long and why no one had seen the signs. The Holloways had no answers. They, too, were left asking the same questions, replaying every memory for clues they had overlooked. When the trial concluded, Claire was sentenced to life without parole. She showed no visible reaction, her face remaining unreadable as the judge delivered the decision. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, their voices carrying the same phrase again and again, the parents who discovered their daughter was a killer. For Michael and Diane, those words would never fade. Their lives, once defined by pride in their child, were now consumed by the weight of her crimes. In the end, the story was not just about a series of murders, but about the silence in which they were carried out. Claire's ability to exist as both the perfect daughter and a hidden predator forced an entire community to question how well anyone can truly know another person. For her parents, the question was even more unbearable. They had loved her without doubt, trusted her without hesitation, and in return had discovered the darkest truth imaginable within their own home.